Friends, for many years, the African-American poet Lucille Clifton served as poet laureate of the state of Maryland. During her tenure as poet laureate, Maryland celebrated its 350th anniversary, and Clifton was asked to write a poem, quote, celebrating Maryland's colonial heritage. That inspired this reply from Clifton. This poem, our reading this morning, it's called Why People Be Mad at Me Sometimes. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories. And I keep on remembering mine. If you were to enter the old burying ground outside these windows and walk a ways past the tombs of clergymen and their families, past the intricately carved memorials to Harvard professors and presidents, and toward a large burial mound, a mound that served as a mass grave for Cambridge residents during a smallpox epidemic, there, near that mound, you'll find a gravestone that bears an inscription, "Here lies the body of Cicely." No last name. And goes on to identify Cicely as a young woman of African descent who was enslaved by the Reverend William Brattle, minister of this church. This morning, I want to share with you some of what we know about Cicely and her life, and I do this first and foremost as an act of respect for her, a respect not afforded her during her lifetime. When she was alive, people in this congregation didn't likely ask the question, "Who is Cicely?" To tell her story is to acknowledge her humanity. And I also offer her story as an invitation to us, all of us, to participate in a process of remembering and reckoning with the legacies of slavery here at First Parish and in our community. You know, let's face it, it's long overdue. But it is now being taken up by many others in our community, by communities of descendants of enslaved persons, by neighboring churches, and of course by the university, as evidenced by its recent report, The Legacy of Slavery at Harvard. A report, by the way, that makes more than passing reference to our church, and that implicates our spiritual ancestors, Reverend Brattle and others, in that university's legacy of slavery. What do we do with this long suppressed legacy? This reckoning, if we choose to undertake it, raises critical moral and spiritual questions for us. Questions like, what is our relationship today to these legacies of oppression? How do we answer for the actions of our ancestors? And importantly, how do we work with others to repair these legacies of harm, violence, and oppression? Friends, there are no easy answers to these questions. And I don't expect us to arrive at answers anytime soon. Rather, this sermon is an invitation to us to embark on a journey together, a journey that our racial equity team and others in the congregation and in the larger community have already begun and are eager for us all to join. A journey that offers us the opportunity to write a new and more just chapter in the story of our community. But let's begin with Cicely. Who was Cicely? Even this seemingly straightforward question is not easy to answer. The lives of white New Englanders, folks who founded this church and the university, are some of the most thoroughly documented lives in American history. The lives of the people they enslaved are not. And so the historical archive can almost perpetuate the erasure of enslaved persons' humanity by continuing to deny them a history, a story. But recent generations of feminist scholars and scholars of color have basically refused to be complicit with the silence of the archive and have gone to extraordinary lengths to piece together fragments that do exist in the archive to bear witness to these lives. One of those scholars is Nicole Saffold Maskell, who last year published in the New England Quarterly an article about Cicely's life. The article and the larger project from which it is drawn are the culmination of an encounter that took place 2 decades ago when, as a 19-year-old black Harvard undergraduate, Maskell happened upon Cicely's grave in the burying ground. And she saw in the grave of a 15-year-old black enslaved woman some of her own story. She writes that her encounter with the mystery of Cicely's life inspired her to become an historian. And we have Professor Maskell to thank for virtually all we know about Cicely's life. We know that she was born in 1697 and was enslaved by William Brattle. We know this because this relationship of enslavement is how she is identified in perpetuity on her gravestone, not by her relationship to her family, as is true with others' gravestones. In fact, we don't know who Cicely's family was, who her parents were. We do know that she lived among and was known by a large community of persons enslaved by the extended Brattle family and by their circle of associates. It's possible that Cicely's mother was one of 2 African-descended women who worked for Brattle's sister, Catherine. We know that Cicely worked closely with a man named Scipio, another person enslaved by the Brattles, and with a free white woman named Sarah Bradish, whom the Brattles employed as a domestic servant. We know that the Brattles paid Sarah £12 a year, which gives us a sense of what Cicely's work would have yielded her had she been a free woman. Probate records after Brattle's death reveal an inventory of the contents of his home, suggesting the kinds of household objects Cicely might have worked with as a servant there: a brass kettle, a pewter quart pot, china, earthenware, glasses. The labor of Scipio, Cicely, Sarah, and others afforded Reverend Brattle the time and opportunity to read, study, teach, care for his congregation, and write sermons like this one, preached to this congregation. We don't know how the Brattles treated Cicely and others, but Maskell did uncover this testimony from one of Brattle's Harvard students who remembered him as, quote, an able, faithful, and tender tutor who nonetheless, quote, searched out vice and browbeat and punished it with the authority and anger of a master. On February 17, 1714, when she was 15 years old, Cicely was baptized and did a remarkable thing. She stood in front of a congregation in Boston, the Brattle Street congregation, founded by the Brattle family, and she made a public confession of her Christian faith. She was presented to the congregation by William's sister, Mary, which suggests that Cicely lived at least a portion of her life across the river in Boston in Mary's home. To make such a public profession would have meant that Cicely was educated in the Christian faith, likely at home under the tutelage of Mary. Here I want to add that baptisms of persons enslaved by members of this church, in this church, were not uncommon. Researchers at the First Church in Cambridge, our sister church down the street with whom we share much of this history before we split, have combed the records and believe that the first such baptism of an enslaved person took place in 1688. Between 1698 and 1705, another 5 enslaved persons were baptized by Reverend Brattle, including Scipio. The frequency of these baptisms accelerated through the middle of the 18th century. And we also know that at least 3 enslaved Native Americans were baptized in the church between 1696 and 1830. Though baptized, black and indigenous persons were almost always denied full communion in the church, voting privileges in the church, and sat segregated from the rest of the congregation. Cicely's gravestone notes that she died on Sunday, April 8th, 1714, at the age of 15. Just 2 months after her baptism. She apparently died in a measles epidemic that took the lives of many young people in Boston and Cambridge that year. Cicely's death is not mentioned anywhere in the extensive papers of the Brattle family. Though they likely paid for her burial and her gravestone, and incidentally, Cicely's is thought by some scholars to be the oldest surviving gravestone of an enslaved person in all of North America. Brattle himself died just 3 years after Cicely at the age of 55, also from measles. Cicely is not buried near the Brattles, whose large family tomb sits very close to the church here. Instead, her grave lies far beyond, near that smallpox burial mound, and the gravestone of another enslaved woman, Jane, who was a servant of Harvard's first steward, Andrew Boardman. These are among the relatively few glimpses into Cicely's life that the historical record offers. And taken alone, these fragments can never do justice to her life and her humanity. But from these fragments, Maskell shapes a concise and moving tribute to Cicely, a kind of eulogy, really. And here it is. There is a poverty in the adjectives that we use to describe the lives of early non-white Americans. But Cicely was vital and real. She felt the cold snow on her skin every winter and knew the shores of the Charles River. She was a daughter and an African-descended Christian convert in a community of black people of various faiths, a New Englander and a denizen of Cambridge. She was a girl on the cusp of womanhood with a body going through extreme change. She was a 15-year-old worker who lived and died during an epidemic. One of the final indignities inflicted upon people of color in colonial New England came at the time of their death. It was common practice for the church bell to toll repeatedly to mark the death of a white person in the parish. When a non-white person died, if the bell tolled at all, it tolled only once, making one's racial subjugation last even unto death. Friends, I want us to pause now and invite us to sit with Cicely's story, with what we know of her life, with what that might mean for our congregation. And as we do, I'm going to ask Rob Moyer to toll our church bell 15 times, one for each year of Cicely's life. Let us be together in a time of reflection. Thank you. Friends, I want to briefly close by bringing us back to this present moment. I know that for me as a white person, whenever I'm confronted by stories like Cicely's, I can get lost in a number of what I'll call spiritual dead ends, right? Maybe you'll be familiar with some of these. I know I can distance myself from the story by saying, well, that was a long time ago, while failing to acknowledge the ways in which legacies of racialized violence and subjugation shape our world today. I can also allow myself to become overwhelmed with shame in a way that centers my own feelings and paralyzes an ethically responsible reckoning. Another dead end. And on the flip side, and I'm not proud of this, I can use these stories to perversely congratulate myself with a kind of smug pat on the back that says, look how far I've come from these misguided ancestors. Look how evolved, how enlightened, how woke. Instead of experiencing these stories as an invitation to examine my own life and the ways that I am complicit in structures of oppression, to ask the question, how might history judge me? As we move forward on this journey, friends, I hope we can help one another avoid these and other pitfalls. I hope we will lift up stories like Sicily's, stories that reveal the legacies of racial violence and subjugation that shaped and shape our community. Because the story isn't over yet. You know, some of us in church were talking about this the other day, and someone said, look, if you don't like the story, write a new ending, right? And there it is right there. That is the opportunity before us, and that's the invitation to us to join with others to help repair legacies of harm and resist structures of oppression. We can help write a new ending to this story. An ending that is simultaneously a beginning. The beginning of a new, more just, and more loving future for all of us. That's my prayer this morning. That's my invitation. Amen. Friends, our closing hymn this morning